So I would like to reintroduce Dr. Tim Fong. And with that, I'm just going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you. Afternoon is underway. So when Susan's like, hey, come on out to Minnesota, I'm like, yeah, that's great. I'll do like a 40-minute session. She's like, yeah, why don't you do a double header? I'm like, come on. So I'm thankful to do this because it's some of you may have seen this show, but there's some new material on this, and this is really where we're focusing on the public health impact of sports betting. And I start with that. When I do a lot of media reports, they're like, oh, Dr. Fong, what do you think we're going to have with all this sports betting, blah, blah, blah. I usually start with, well, it's a public health issue no different than air quality, food quality, tobacco, alcohol, controlled cannabis. It impacts individuals, families, communities, and the state. So we have to think of it as a public health issue. And that's really the lens that I have here for this afternoon. So we're going to talk about what we've known, what we've seen, and in particularly, again, for clinicians, things you should be doing right now with your clients that you're seeing, and then things you should be preparing for when you get more clients with sports betting, who are sports bettors with gambling disorder. And then lastly, just like last session, talk about things you can do as an organization, as a clinic, as a foundation, whatever you are, to address this, because it's coming. You know, it's not here today in Minnesota as legal, regulated, but it is here today in Minnesota as unregulated illegal activities. And technically, you know, we could download apps on our phones right now and be gambling during this session, and none of it would be legal, but it would be available. So I start off with this, and it's a little fuzzy, but it's it. You know, if I had just an hour to talk about this, I would. And our immediate reaction is, yes, this is funny, but this is also literally the official ad taken from a gambling operator. So this was their official above board. This got past someone in a boardroom. This got past the PR people. Someone gave it a thumbs up. They sent it to the printer, the magazines or whatnot, looked at it and said, okay, we're going to run it. And literally, when you think about this, the expansion issue, we've now gone, this photo has everything in it, right? It has the 24-hour access. It's embedded in everything you do in your life now. It has that fear of missing out that literally you can't go 3 minutes without this because you might miss that opportunity. Now, I'm not saying, they don't say what he's actually doing on the phone. So the ad there was no like header. It just said, you know, the name of the company, and there you go. And you see all the fine print on the bottom, right? But I don't think there's an image better than this that highlights kind of the surge, the demand, the excitement, the hilarity, the humanness, what are we doing with ourselves when it comes to sports betting? Because if I showed this picture, you know, 10 years ago, people would have been like, that's ridiculous, that's censored, that's pornography, you can't show this. And literally, this is a national betting organization. So we start off with a couple cases, or one case actually, highlighting how I see sports betting expansion happening. And this is a real case. This is a guy, Greg, who's 39. He's been a patient of mine for about 5 years and doing well in terms of treatment for alcohol, generalized anxiety, not seeing me for gambling, and monthly visits, the standard stuff, things did well. Then in 2019, he moved to New York. He had a hard time finding a new psychiatrist there. So pre-pandemic, we were still doing telehealth, telemedicine, and he was doing great. Well, New York, January 2022, boom, they expand official sports betting. They introduce the online sports betting, right? And immediately that first month, he gets caught up in the wave. Well, everyone else is doing it. It's interesting. People are talking about it. Football playoffs. So he starts off spending $40 to $80 per week, like going out, you know, for a meal. Single game bets, just betting the game, winners or loser. He watches the games he's on. His wife is kind of aware he's doing that. She knows about the app. She knows he's in recovery. She doesn't really put up I don't think you should be doing that. Then a couple months later, in the baseball season and the basketball season, he's still betting casually in the sense of $40 to $80 a week. But then he threw some money on what's called a 5-leg parlay. For those of you not familiar, it means you had one bet and you need 5 things to happen, 5 actual unique things to win that bet. And for that one bet, he won $2,500. So low entrance wager with a large reward. Boom, what does that do to the brain? What does that do to the body? What does that do? Surge of dopamine, surge of adrenaline, surge of excitement. Wow, I'm good at this. All that stuff exploded. And with that, that's where he was well on his way to develop a gambling disorder. He was betting more, betting frequently, all the things we heard about this morning, right? He's just really excited, started getting higher and higher stakes. By August, so this is really 7 months after his first bet, he had spent the $2,500 he'd won, and he spent another $5,000 on his own. So that's $7,500 in expenses that he spent. And now, unfortunately, the other criteria of a gambling disorder start to show up. The lying to his wife, the chasing the losses, being preoccupied by getting money and spending money on this mobile phone. Says, I'm going to cut down, I'm going to stop this behavior. Then that goes for a few days, but then he's back on pouring again, 20, 40 bucks, trying to win another 2,500. So he's not pouring $1,000 a bet. He's pouring $25 a bet. So if you were to ask him, are you having tolerance? Technically isn't. But he's still spending money, and it's growing the total expenditure. A lot of anxiety around his life. September, wife discovers the expenses on a credit card report, and immediately she threatens divorce, not because of the money spent, but because of what? The lying that she'd endured from the alcohol, that she'd endured prior to the pandemic. The lying was what was going to end this relationship, not the money spent. His emotional pain reaches near lethal emotional pain in 1 year, in 9 months. And we're not talking about huge debts, about 10 grand that he spent, but the idea that he could lose his wife and now his 2 kids that are young. What happens? Alcohol comes back. So he relapses to the alcohol to which he was treating me. And here's the kicker. I'd probably had about 4 or 5 sessions with him during the year 2022. But it wasn't until September 2022, 9 months after his first bet on sports, did he tell me about it. And meanwhile, we're logged on. He sees my sign behind my gambling studies program. When he first came to me in 2018, he's like, I don't have a gambling problem, but I'm going to see you. Is that okay? And so this entire time, he never told me. And that was a perfect example of the guilt, the shame, the fear, the denial, that even for a guy that I've known for a while, for 5 years, and even though we had a strong relationship, that he knew I was a gambling treatment expert, he could not bring himself to mention it. So he said in the last 30 seconds, I have one last thing to tell you, Dr. Fong. I've really been struggling with online gambling like that. Right? The shame. And no other form of gambling behavior, I think, have we seen. This shame is so great. So I said to him, well, we're out of time. I'll see you in a month. No, I said, we're out of time today, but this is so important. Let's schedule another telehealth visit tomorrow. And that was the beauty of telehealth, giving us that freedom to do that. So that was something. So fast forward now, he's doing much better. But, the thing about, for him, the gambling, he wasn't doing to escape anything in the beginning. The dopamine was phenomenally intense. Then it was to make money. Then it was the other newer things that pop in, and many of us who are doing the gambling treatment know this. It was things like, I like showing off to my friends that I knew more about sports. I knew about things that were going to happen. I said, do you think you were skilled at that? Well, I did, because I won $2,500. I said, you didn't win $2,500 based on any skill, and that was the whole thing. He's like, no, I knew these 5 things were going to happen, but those 5 things still ultimately were just random luck. He was chasing his losses not to cover back the finances a little bit, but because he couldn't stand the idea that some faceless corporation on his phone was taking his money and beating him. So that was the fascinating part. As he was driving up those $10,000 in debt, it wasn't 10 bets. It was probably around $120, $40 bets. He was trying to chase that big win, but he was also trying to get his money back from corporations that he's like, these are a bunch, and literally he said to me later on, these are a bunch of bros. I don't like that. I don't like losing to these guys. I want to win their money. I'm like, you're not playing against them. He's like, but I don't like them having. It was much more of a negative view than, say, like a casino that a lot of our folks have. And some, of course, I'm going to change it. All right, so what does that bring up? Obviously, he had incredible vulnerabilities to start, the alcohol use disorder. Could there have been anything that had been done to prevent this? Anything I could have said to him in, say, January, February, March? Anything that his wife could have done? What could he have done to help find help sooner. And again, you heard from Leah this morning, did he do any responsible gambling activities on that app? No. If he had gotten a message from the company, compared to when you first logged on in January, your expenditures and your frequency are concerning, red flag. No. What actually will work in treatment for him? What if he never mentioned that within the last 30 seconds? Because even though I had known him for a while, I wasn't asking him about gambling consistently every time. I just didn't think about it because it was never part of his daily routine. So you put that together, that's the kind of case I think we're going to face and are facing right now, exponentially much more so. And again, the languages are really interesting, right? We use different language terms all the time. There's sports wagering, sports betting, sports gaming, sports gambling, sports entertainment, and everything we use every day. I'm going to double down, or I guarantee you that this will happen at work, blah, blah, blah. So I think we got to be a lot more precise. So I've been trying to use mainly a person who bets sports or sports bettor with gambling disorder. So the implication is a sports bettor is someone with gambling disorder. No, it's not. There's people who just bet on sports that don't have any problem. So sports betting, sports gambling, kind of interchangeable. That's how I think about it. California, if you haven't been there in the last couple of years, it's really, really different, right? We have all sorts of things going on. I'll just leave it at that. But again, our prevalence survey, now 15 years, 2.2, 1.5, problem or pathological, 3.7% of Californians walking around in 2006 had a lifetime history of gambling disorder. Within the last year, that number was 1.3 who developed that condition within last year. Fast forward to 2023, we have not replicated this statewide survey. We have no reason to believe that it's any greater or any less. So we know based on lots of other stuff, it's going to be hovering around that. But in California, we have the card rooms, we have the lottery, tribal casino, and we have horse racing. So people say, well, where do you have sports betting? So right now we have online horse racing, which is sports betting. You can do that in California legally. We have same-day fantasy sports, or fantasy things that are, of course, legal but not regulated by the state. So we have thousands of customers every day that play same-day fantasy sports, and zero tax revenue is collected by the state of California. So it's an operation that's still happening there. So we see that happening. And that's where we are with California, 82 actually casinos. You can bet it. And again, here's where we had that sports betting. The daily fantasy sports not regulated. So in Minnesota, do you have daily fantasy sports here, Susan? Again, does any of that money go back to the state of Minnesota in any way? It's not. It should, but it's not. We don't have traditional sports betting on those apps yet. I have a lot more to say about that. And of course, we have unregulated sports betting online and in real life. And I'll just jump to my biggest concern that even when you legalize and regulate sports betting in that state, you don't stop the unregulated playing. And again, as much as I love Dr. Nauer's work, none of that applies to the unregulated space. So even if you have incredible affordability tools, incredible responsible gambling tools, how are you going to do that for a website that operates in the shadows outside the United States and no one can shut them down? A number of my patients, I always ask them to show me their sites. And I look at these sites, these unregulated gambling, sports betting sites, and they're as fast and as sophisticated as anything else that are out there. They work incredibly well. They even have 1-800 numbers for technical support, but they operate in the shadows. And so until we figure out a way to shut them down, we're just going to see more and more and more of these coming out. And of course, we have the online horse racing betting. So a few months, almost a year ago now, that's where we were close. We had 2 propositions on the ballot to get mobile sports betting in California, or one inside the brick and mortar casinos, and both propositions failed miserably. And they were not just miserably, but 18% of the public voted yay. And this was against a background of 4 years of the nation saying we want more gambling. Our states demand it. This wasn't because Californians were like, no, we don't want gambling. This was because there were 2 competing propositions that were confusing, and there were a lot of people fighting over this quote alleged prize. So California voters are like, you know what? No, we don't like that. Forget about it. So, but it's going to come back 2024. And again, if I said a state of 40 million people, that's the potential pool of customers. You can see why everyone looks at California as a potential. So same thing in Minnesota. What's Minnesota? Like 4 million? 5 million? Again, that's still a significant number and of potential new revenue that would come in from that. Nationally, and this is the same slide Leah showed earlier, but I want to highlight things that we've learned and really things that I've learned in 5 years, and but it's all sorts of stuff. We know that every state that opens this up, you get more calls to the helpline, right? More intakes, more problems. Also, more people just looking for, how do I download the app? How do I find what's the line on the Minnesota Vikings game tonight, right? So the real question is, what do we do with those calls? Because a lot of folks say, hey, that's a chance to actually talk to somebody and tell them about gambling and maybe resources. And I think that's true. At the same time, it's a clear sign we have to invest more in that first step when people are asking. Number two, we know that you have robust participation when you introduce mobile sports betting. That means lots of new people sign up. Lots of people get introduced. Lots of people start doing it. And with no formal education, I think that's so true. There's no license for you that you have to pass to gamble with. And I did this about a year ago. I was in Chicago, and I said, I wonder how fast I could go from downloading the app, putting money into the account, and placing a wager. So I did that inside an airplane within 3 minutes. So within 3 minutes, I downloaded the app, I opened up an account, and I poured money in off a PayPal account, and I had placed a wager. That's what we're talking about, the technology. That's where we have to then say, wait a minute, is that what we want in our state? And if we do, how do we ensure that the protections are in place for people who are really vulnerable? Again, all sorts of new bets and betting options. You heard Leah talk about it this morning, and I'm sure Brian and Jeffrey can talk about it more. The same game parlay, right? 3 years ago, I never knew what that was. Well, now, again, that's about 60% of the market of sports betting. So again, it's like I'll put $5 down on tonight's Monday Night Football game. And inside the one game, before the game starts, I'm betting that 5 things are going to happen. And those 5 things have to happen for me to win. But I don't get $5 back. I'll put my $5 and I can win $60 or $80 or $100. So it's basically like the lottery where you're putting a small wager for a much bigger jackpot. That's very different than traditional sports betting or, quote, sports handicapping. To me, that's the lottery. You're just basically throwing numbers out mathematically. It is not a skill-based at all. It is completely pure chance, dominating 60 to 70% of the revenue. And now a lot of the companies will push out, oh, we built a same-game parlay for you to enjoy. So again, those actually turn out to be much less profitable for the person, much more profitable for the company. We also know, again, what happens to the incidence and prevalence of gambling disorder in states that introduce sports betting. And because this is still within 5 years, we don't have solid data to say, well, if you introduce sports betting and then in 2 years' time, the incidence goes up by 0.5% or by 0.25%. We don't have that yet. But we do know that traditionally, when you introduce it, yes, there's more people playing, there's more potential problems, but it also is mitigated by if you have more prevention programs, more education, or if you have a robust state legislature that's actually working on monitoring and support. And we've seen nothing but national discourse and coverage, which is really great. At the same time, we don't have a federal response, and we don't have even all our states aligned to say what it is that we want. We still have just a state-by-state issue on expansion. So the things that I also under these trends, I mentioned the same game parlay, is I can't predict what the next dominant form of sports betting will be in 5 years from now. I mean, after this fades out, what's the next thing? So there's always going to be something else that we can't even predict right now, which is why we have to continue to be on top of these things. Number two, where does this tax money go? And I think we're beholden to the states to say that are now have expanded regulation, that tax money is going where? Yes, some states are saying some of that money is being set aside for gambling disorder and prevention and treatment, but that's a tenth of it, right? Where does the rest of it go? Are we now cutting programs from other things? Is it a zero-sum game? That sort of thing. And then I think things that we haven't even thought about before, think about the partnerships that are happening with sports betting right now. If I said to you 10 years ago, NFL Hall of Fame quarterback, gambling operator, commercial on television. No one would have been like, no, that's not possible. That's what we have right now. Sports stars, and now colleges and now gambling operators all combined to create advertising above board. So we're seeing the merging of different organizations that we never, ever thought would ever see happen. So I think it's on us to get into those rooms to say, hey, why does this happen? So one of the big firestorms that happened in this gambling world over the last 2 years, right, was colleges that partnered with gambling operators and pushed out to underage college students, encouraging them to sign up for the gambling app that is partnership with the school. Yet, when we think about that, what happens in that room with the college administrators who said, oh, this is a good idea, let's do it? They didn't have a voice from our field to say, you know, what you're doing not only is morally wrong, but it's also illegal because it's under 21. That's unbelievable to me that no one even had that sense. And I think that goes back to why we know there's so much work that needs to be done in this area. And again, the impact of social media coverage on sports betting is really fascinating, where you get a bunch of influencers, again, as I mentioned earlier, that this is their job to get number of views, and they're not paid by the gambling operator. That is just their own initiative, finding their space in the online world, saying, this is how I'm going to make money. I'm going to monetize my ability to go online and talk about gambling and talk about my favorite picks about the day. So here's an example of something that will show up. This is an official thing. So this is where this person put $1, 25 leg parlay, all those things came in. That person won 94,000. You see the emoji, you see this tossed around social media, and essentially you'll get a bunch of free advertising for this. You know, when it gets handed around social media, people are, oh my God, somebody did this. So you see a lot of gamblers post their winning bets, right? Or you see, or worse, I'll see a lot of gamblers post their near winning bet or that near miss, which then perpetuates the idea that I was close, potentially will win more. So what are we doing about this? Well, I mentioned what we do in California with our state program. And right now, without sports betting in California being fully legal, we know that of all the patients who show up into our statewide treatment system, that sports betting is the fourth most common type of gambling activity they're developing harm from. Slot machines, number one. Table games, number two. In real life poker, number three. And this is without any sort of above board. Yeah. So we got a question here, we'll take it.
Is that based on dollar amounts?
So the way we asked this, we asked the client coming into treatment, which form of gambling have you been doing the last 12 months? Then we asked them, which one of the forms of gambling is the one that's creating the most harm for you? So lots of folks indicate they do lots of types of gambling, but some gambling they do doesn't generate harm. This is the one that is. So sports betting. So the idea is right now, if you expand sports betting, will that rise up to number two or number three? And if it does, that means we have to have some dedicated treatment strategies for that. Yeah, follow up. So yeah, so this would include all of that. Sport, yeah. So most of this in California is either horse racing or the unregulated illegal sports betting websites that people can access. And I think, and so they indicate that's sports betting. And that's also a part of the education. A lot of folks, of our patients, did not realize that those unregulated sports betting sites were unregulated. They thought they were above board. They thought, everyone's talking about sports betting. It's on ESPN. It's on everything I see. Isn't it legal? I see ads in the stadiums. How could it not be? And when they see the websites, they're so glitzy, it's not like an MS-DOS, ASCII, old school. No, these are sophisticated websites that change in a minute. So I wish I could show you some of these, but obviously I think that would be a little too triggering. But if you're curious, I mean, I have a bunch of them. All right, so unfortunately, in some of the profiles of our sports bettors is that much like we'd expect with the other forms, they start betting at a younger age. They start having gambling disorder issues at a younger age in their life. They're also younger when they're coming into treatment. Again, meaning we need different ways to engage them. And you're going to hear from Brian and Jeff about that's how ways to engage folks like that. They aren't necessarily going to be the first ones to call the helpline or walk into a JA room. So first, when I think about in working with clients with sports betting, oftentimes our existing instruments don't name sports betting, whether it be gambling screening instruments or don't think about it. So we really have to do better at screening and assessment. So not just saying, well, do you gamble? Or in the last 12 months, tell me about your gambling. Because sometimes people don't view their sports gambling as gambling. They'll say, no, it's investing or it's sports betting. That's not the same as gambling, right? And as silly as that sounds, that's why words matter, because traditionally people would think of gambling as slots and blackjack, and sometimes they may not think of betting on sports as betting on sports. So I had a client once who said, whose primary thing was just betting on Taiwanese table tennis. And this is a very popular thing among a lot of states. I said to him, what are you doing here? Are you betting on sports? He's like, no, this is a financial investment. This is no different than stocks. He's like, I don't know the players. I don't know the game. All I'm looking for are just the number I like that will make me my financial investment based on trends of that player. And I said, just like a stock. He's like, exactly, it's just like a stock. So he didn't view it as gambling. He viewed it as investing. So as I said to him, do you gamble on sports? He'd be like, no. And that's why it came out that he saw it as investing. So reaching that population, again, by traditional measures like, do you gamble, may not necessarily work. We have to come up with other things. Oftentimes, it's super important for me in the intake really to define what their views are on sports, what they get out of it, how they view it. It is embedded in our country. Sports is one of the most powerful popular culture pillars we have. So one of the questions we get all the time, right, from sports bettors with gambling disorder is what? Can I still watch sports again? Can I ever watch sports again? That's a question that comes up a lot in treatment, and each person gets a different answer depending on their clinical course. I think that's super important. So one thing you look in the DSM-5, we don't do this where we specify gambling disorder, the type of gambling that's creating harm. So we don't have this officially yet, but I really call providers and therapists to do this when you're writing your notes, gambling disorder, and you put the actual type of gambling that they're struggling with. And I think that will give us more specificity. I don't think we're going to see this in the modified version of the DSM in the next 5 or 10 years, but it's just something. And if you use an electronic system to track clients through the state, that would get very valuable. So we have an electronic database system we use in California, so we're encouraging our providers. That's how we're able to get some of that information about which specific forms of gambling are causing the harm. So the clinical experience I have with folks at UCLA is similar and mirrors what you'd expect. But the folks who are coming, these are, again, the folks coming into treatment, the ones who end up in my office, who end up on the Zoom, predominantly male, highly educated, 18 to 35, millennial, Gen Z, predominantly Caucasian, love sports, very sophisticated technology, very psychologically minded. They do not like GA. They want an alternative. They have families that are around but tend to be, unfortunately, way too supportive. So that's just a thumbnail. That's who we're seeing calling our program at UCLA. But we all know that there's a lot of other profiles of men and women out there who are gambling on sports that don't show up. This is the profile of the person who shows up to treatment. So when I ask them, why are you here? They're like, I'm just sick and tired of being sick and tired. The general thing, pressures from parents, pressure from spouses, saw an ad somewhere, had the courage to actually call because they are psychologically minded. So sometimes maybe the profile of who we see isn't because that's the most vulnerable, it's just the profile of the person who's willing to make that call. Yes, sir. And get him a mic, Oh, no, I'm good. Oh, you got to shout it out.
So question, right, kind of goes back to what you're talking about with the gambling at colleges and stuff like that, right? And then you're looking at this age. In Minnesota, right, it's 18 to gamble across the board. Do you think that this is something that we're seeing more and more younger people gambling, that as it becomes legal and more legal across the states, if we could look to raise the age of gambling and going to casinos like that to like a 21 or something?
It's an awesome question. Why is it 21 and over? I mean, it's just arbitrary. But why is it 21 over for alcohol? Why is it 18 and up for nicotine? Why is it 21 over for cannabis? We have some theories, yes, we're waiting for the brain to develop. Yes, you need to be an adult to make decisions. But why is it at age 18 you can vote? Why is it at age 18 you can join the military? We had a bill in California that allowed a 17-year-old to vote. And everyone got all up in arms about that. Oh, my God, 17-year-old, you can't possibly know right from wrong. And what? So those are, I think, the much tougher questions. For me, I think it needs to be in line with all our other known addictive behaviors. And it needs to be 21 because the brain isn't developed, because choice isn't developed, because you need more maturity. But that's an arbitrary cause. If it turned out it was better to legalize it for 16-year-olds, then we should be doing that. But then we should be giving them a license to gamble, like we're licensed to drive. Why do we let them drive at 16? Why not wait until their brains are fully developed? So there are a lot of these weird public health questions that we haven't quite really, I think, answered properly, but we're stuck with this world where this is the law, and yet we don't enforce the law for a 17-year-old who gambles illegally on a legal website. So a whole host of questions that we just need to do better at. But I think, unfortunately, what we have created is a generation that is expected to have access to gambling, that already has access to gambling, and because no one is shutting down underage gambling, they're like, well, if anyone else is doing it, I should be allowed to do it as a 15, 16-year-old. I'll get to my roadmap later, because one of the biggest problems with today's teenager and young person, they have access to do two things that I never did when I was a kid. They have access to, obviously, gambling, but then they have access to almost an unbelievable and infinitesimal amount of money and capital. And so that's the big difference between teenagers, right? They can get online loans, they can get PayPal, they get Venmo. I have a whole thing about this a little bit later on when you have finance later this afternoon. I'm so glad for that, because that's the difference. The young person today doesn't need a car to gamble, doesn't need a credit card, because he can just use his mom and dad's credit card on that. Well, more on that. So things that I do during the intake session, I'm talking about sports betting. Again, that means another 5 or 10 minutes in the session, really getting specificity about where, when, how, who, what do you like about that type of bet, for what reason are you doing same-game parlays versus long-term props versus other things, what do you get out, long shot favorites, all that helps me get a perception of how their brain works. Risk-taking, loss aversion, what are they doing? And it's not going to be triggering for them. And a lot of therapists who are getting started in gambling work worry about it. If they keep asking questions about gambling, am I going to trigger them to want to gamble? No, you are not. If anything, you're going to be helping them by identifying exactly where the cognitive distortions are. And again, even having them showing you their apps, showing you their devices, in my mind, is absolutely critical, because it helps us learn what they're doing. So, a couple things. So the other treatment principles, unfortunately, we have not a lot, where we say what's specific for a sports bettor with gambling disorders. I'll put number 2, because everyone always wants to know that. What do you say to patients about watching sports? I say very simply, if you're watching sports and it brings you connection with people in your life that you feel positive social connections with, then that's something that you need. If you're watching sports and it re-aggravates your signs and symptoms of your gambling disorder, that cannot happen. We have to find an alternative. So I don't have a blanket for everyone. I explore with every person. Invariably, it's really good when their family members come in and we talk about it together. Is this something you're okay with your husband or your wife watching sports because they developed a problem? And in fact, many of the partners are like, well, no, I would much rather watch sports together because I know that he or she's not gambling. It's when he's not watching, I know he's gambling because he's too stressed to watch. So it's all sorts of things that go back and forth. So let me show you a few things that we have. So this is a data taken from a sports betting related gambling disorder clinical trial of CBT. And I'll jump right to it, where they basically highlight that CBT practices seem to work specifically for sports bettor with gambling disorder when the CBT practices were tailored for sports bettors. So that means having a whole treatment manual that addresses the cognitive distortions that are unique to sports that you'll see there. So we don't have head-to-head data right now, evidence-based, to say which one is better than others for sports betting. They all seem to work. So we tend to stick with what we know seems to work, which is focusing on just good principles of recovery, right? Home, physical health, sense of purpose, sense of community, things like that. But there are other unique things here with sports bettors that we've emerged. Number one, the time betting on sports, since you're not driving 2 hours to the casino back and forth, is erased. But the time spent on sports betting can still be just as much. Looking at bets, reading about teams, going through different websites, having a bunch of different apps. One of the things that we forget that many states that have sports betting have multiple operators, right? 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 different gambling operators. So that's where a lot of time is spent going on the different websites and looking and shopping across the different lines. So we have to really be mindful that the time spent gambling isn't physical going there, but it's spent physically, mentally occupied by doing it and then not doing something else that's healthier. The urges and cravings and preoccupations we know seem to be a lot more centered around not accepting losses. Again, like Greg, just not wanting to lose to somebody else, to a faceless corporation. And again, for whatever reason, the vast majority of the patients we're seeing at UCLA and in our state program do not accept 12-step right away, even though we strongly encourage it. Now, in response, some of our 12-step meetings are getting a little bit more specific to sports betting, but not as open, and that's why we have to find more folks out there as well. So on a few of the other treatment principles we have evolved in California for our folks. Number one, really spending time identifying the seduction of the enticements. So when you hear language like no risk, sweat-free bets, or just teasers, these are the enticements that oftentimes people in recovery are getting. So we have to spend a lot of time shutting down those offers, or better yet, building up recovery coping tools when you're faced with an offer like that. So I just worked with a client last week, right before the start of football season, and he thought he had stopped all the emails, but there were still new things popping up on his social media feeds that he didn't anticipate, gambling ads that were popping up there. And so we had to have a whole session on talking about how to manage those thoughts and those feelings of these, and to figure out where were these ads coming from, because you weren't actually on the site. So what we realized where they were coming from, because he was actually doing the work on his computer to get rid of his accounts by other ads, but the computer was registering it as you were looking and interested in gambling. So it was a perfect example where technology was continuing to work against him. Our gambling digital innovations, and I'm so excited to see some of our financial folks here, because these are the new digital innovations that we can use in recovery. GamBan, of course, the blocker that you put on your phone or your devices to prevent you from getting onto sites as a tool. More and more mobile apps coming out there. Chat functioning, again, put a call out for our helpline folks out there in TELUS Healthcare. They do have chat functions through the helpline with the engaged clients into treatment and education, things like that. But this is the last one. I'm not going to steal the thunder from our finance people, but I actually spend a lot more time, I think, than most psychiatrists talking about money, financial obligations, what it means, what happens if you don't pay, bankruptcy, financial health, psychology of money. All that's not what I was trained in as a psychiatrist, but it's now something I embed in what we do because it's such a huge part. As an example, so many of my clients get so distressed about the money they owe to payday loans, it just generates more loans. And when we actually talk about, what it would mean to pay these off, or what does it mean to be indebted to a predatory online faceless loan company that has no interest in you as a person, these are very powerful things to think about. This is what GamBan looks like. If you haven't seen it, other treatment principles for sports bettors. One of the things that we see a lot in recovery is that sports bettors say, well, I know I don't look at the sports lines anymore, but every now and then I'll see a game or I'll see a team, and I knew I would have naturally bet heavy on that, and that triggers me with that fear of missing out. That triggers me to say a little bit of regret or doubt or just anger that I'm not still gambling. So that's a different kind of a trigger that we're dealing with. And really, for a lot of our sports bettors who are constantly in action, think about the guy in the toilet, constantly seeking dopamine, constantly seeking more. Where can they find other bursts of dopamine in their lives? other bursts of dopamine that are healthier and that don't challenge them in compulsive ways. And again, really building those resiliency training on how to deal with adversity and financial losses. One of the things interesting early on, we don't talk with our patients about, again, in the future, should you gamble and sustain more losses, how are you going to deal with that? And I think that's really interesting. I think we heard a little bit about that before lunch. The idea that constantly not just saying don't gamble, but saying how can we build up your strength so that if you do endure more harm or more losses from gambling, what are you actually going to do to handle that? Okay, so let me get right into this part because the ideas I think that are super critical. Number one, if your state introduces more gambling, what happens to the rate of gambling disorder? So now we know, again, trying to figure out if you went from 1% to 2%, that's doubling. That's literally nearly millions of people, right? So we know who are most vulnerable at risk, but who else is potentially at risk from expansion of mobile sports betting we're not even thinking about? So of course we know that the poor, folks from communities of color, substance use disorders, active mental health conditions, we know they are going to be at risk. But with mobile sports betting, who are the other categories that are potentially at risk, including older adults, college students for sure, people who are much more impulsive or risk-taking, or people who are much more technologically savvy online. These are the new categories we have to start thinking about. So how do we stop the underage? And this is really pivotal. So when sports betting comes to Minnesota, when the legislation gets written, this is really where interfacing with them to say this needs to have very strong language about that. And it starts with enforcement. Are you going to have massive penalties to an operator if they let high school kids on there? How are you going to enforce that? Where are you going to get the people? So I'll give you a quick story. So about a year ago, I was in a state that had mobile sports betting. I downloaded the app, got it on my phone. And then it was a family trip. And then 2 days later, at that time, I think he was 15, our 15-year-old son was like, hey, Dad, this app that you got for betting is really cool. I'm like, what are you talking about? And then his phone is linked to my phone with the same Apple ID cloud. So on his phone, all the apps I downloaded, all automatically downloaded on his phone with passwords too. So he was able to access on his phone the gambling app I had on my phone. So that's a perfect example of underage gambling, no enforcement. The computer thought it was me using it from his device. But he could have made all these bets unbeknownst to me. So there are a lot of these loopholes that we have to think about. How do we close that? And again, how do we contain that access to digital currency for young people? On his phone right now, he has Apple ID, Apple Wallet, he has my credit cards, he has Apple Pay, he has Venmo, he has PayPal, he has Cash App, and he has Zelle. And that's probably true for a lot of teenager and young people in this room or out and about. But how do we contain that access for young people? Very, very, very difficult. In advertising, that's going to be the biggest one. And again, you think about how should we enforce advertising? How do we regulate it? How do we promote it? Because you can't do things like no printed material or billboards within 100 feet of the school when the massive form of advertising is social media. So what are the proper messaging that should be put out there? And I think that's really where, if I were to advise any state legislator on the advertising requirements, I'd say we'd focus on delaying that first bet until you're 21, would focus on reducing the frequency of your betting so you're not betting every single day, and we learn from tobacco and alcohol what's really, really worked. So like in California, what's really, really worked for cutting out tobacco from young people is strong public health presence, high taxes, strong policies and laws. Well, that worked very well to stop smoking, but what happened? We invented vaping. So this is always the thing, is that you have to be constantly on the vanguard of trying to figure out how do we do better and better to minimize some of these public health consequences. So what I ask you now is to think about what are we going to look like 10 years from now. So the year is 2033. We've now had almost 15 years of sports betting legalization. We've had a good 10-year run of states now maturing into their markets of what sports betting is doing. So on one end is the really fearful thought is that we would have a gambling crisis like we do with an opioid crisis where you have more bankruptcy, more financial damage, more societal harm, more suicide, the whole 9 yards, right? On the other hand, you have, well, it's just now embedded. It's just another thing in society we got to deal with. And there's just like a low baseline rate of kind of like just damage. Or you heard, again, Leo mentioned this morning, well, the vast majority of people who do it aren't so harmed, but it's just that tiny percentage that spend 30, 40%. Well, that's still a lot of people that are doing that. So that's the real question. And I don't have answers for that right now. But as we embark on this, has to be that lens to say, what do we need to do to protect individuals, families, and society? And right now, when you Google help for sports betting, invariably what you're going to get are just a bunch of ads on how to bet on sports, how to get the app, how to, which are the best places to do it. So the real question is, where should we as gambling disorder and problem gambling advocates land on that Google search? Should it be number one? Should we be buried inside that? Where is our seat at the table for all of this related to sports betting? So my to-do list is this. Number one, if you're working with clients, it's focusing on sources of money, really trying to figure out how to shut down and limit access to the online predatory lenders, cutting off the teasers and promos that you're routinely going to get through your emails and through your social media, and really also making sure that there is no crossover to the other financial tech investing stuff like the Robinhood, the Webull, the Crypto.com to replace the sports betting. Again, look at our responsible gambling messaging. And if I do this when I talk to a lot of young people, I say, number one, my message is this: gambling is not a sustainable way to make money. You're not going to make money consistently and over long stretches of time on gambling. That's it. People want to challenge me, go right ahead. That's not what it is. If you're doing an activity that's defined as gambling and you're trying to make sustainable income from that, it will not happen. That's number one. Number two, for the young people, how do you manage this fear of missing out? How do you manage a world where everyone else is showcasing, I did so great at this, and then you didn't, ha. That is always the ultimate thing for young people, and even for us adults. How do we manage that missing out fear? And number three, and this is very true, you don't have special skills in predicting the future. I wish we did. We all wish that. And so much of sports betting is about this false belief that I have a special talent. I've always, had friends that, oh, I'm really good at picking over-unders. Or I'm really good at picking spreads. I'm really good at, knowing when overtime's coming. I'm like, you wish you were. But none of us have this special skill. And why? We all want special skills, right? We all want to be superheroes and be able to do incredible things. And that's where I think the gambling has tapped into this theme of a lot of young people where they want to be a superhero and they want to have spectacular skills, but that's not going to happen. So these aren't really sexy messages. You're not special, you're not going to win money, and you're going to miss out on stuff. I mean, so I'm not in advertising, but you can see that's a message. A lot of young people are like, that's not really what I want to know, right? We have to tell our state legislators what we're seeing, what we're doing, what we're happening. When was the last time any of you wrote to a state legislator advocating for more attention to gambling disorder? Just a few. We don't do that enough. We don't agitate our legislator. This is not going to be a topic they're going to take on unless they hear from us. We have to do a lot more with the media, and this has been the last 8 months or so. There's been a lot of media attention. I'll usually get 2 or 3 calls from the media throughout the week saying, hey, can you come in and talk about sports betting and blah, blah, blah. And it tends to be a lot of the same interest, but it's also so amazing to me how curious the media are, and they don't think about some of these things that we deal with all the time. And again, we have to think about how do we get folks at an earlier stage. I've heard some people talk about, again, if you sign up for these apps that you have to pass like a test in order to get a gambling license, that's not going to happen. And you heard this morning the opt out instead of opt in. I thought that was really interesting because right now there is no opting in. And so very, very interesting stuff. So we have something now in California we're really proud of. Westside Gambling Treatment is a sports betting only gambling treatment program that's paid for by our state of California. So This is an intensive outpatient program. They have 7-week program, 3 sessions a week, groups, individual therapy, a whole curriculum dedicated just for sports betting. So we're really excited about that. And then I'll end, make sure we have plenty of time. We're about 8 or 9 minutes for questions. Again, my contact info, thanks for putting up with me for 2 hours today. I have our website, that's my Twitter, and that's my email. Again, other questions, other ideas, please do so. But that's my tour of sports betting. We're going to do a few questions, we're going to get the break, and then Brian and Jeff are going to talk about their amazing podcast, and we're going to go from there. And again, please introduce yourself with the question. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you,
That was
Susan.
terrific. While I'm walking, Tim mentioned Gamban, and Gamban is an app that we offer a free subscription for a year, so to anybody in Minnesota. So if you're interested, we have a brochure on the table, but you can contact me, you can contact the helpline, and they will give you the code to get the app.
Thank you. I appreciate, my name is Dan Johnson. I work with mHealth Fairview in substance and gambling addiction. So I've heard from you, and I think from one of the other speakers too, that the goal is to focus on, say, sports betting, to help the client stop. They're aware that's the area of gambling. My concern with that is I do think we need to meet the client where they're at. We need to really understand the problem they're coming in to address. But so many times we'll find out in the process that even though they identify 2 years of heavy-duty sports betting, eventually it comes out that they've got 20 years of being a day trader. But that didn't come up for a long period of time. So my concern is I think there's a danger in focusing on the one thing. In substance abuse, it was always the issue. The client would say, well, I'm not drinking the hard liquor anymore. I know I had a problem with the hard liquor. With the whiskey, that was my problem, but the beer isn't the problem. And I'm a little concerned that I'm hearing some of this that I do agree we need to meet the client where they're at. We need to understand and to validate the concern they're coming to us with. But I think we also need to help them understand the global picture of gambling is the issue as much as just sports gambling is the issue.
No, and that's very good. And again, there's 2 things here. Again, what we're highlighting here is encourage folks who aren't asking about sports betting to start asking about it, because many providers are unaware of that or don't put that. That's number 1. Number 2, if you were to sit with me, you'd be almost like, well, what are you talking about? So I'm focusing more on wellness and quality of life. So the vast majority of my clients, regardless of gambling, I actually don't talk about a lot about gambling inside that session. We talk about, are you getting sleep? Are you exercising physical movement? What are you putting in your body nutritionally? What are you putting in your body that could be harmful substances? Where are you getting positive social connections? What are you doing about boredom and loneliness and lethal emotional pain? So much of that phrase goes back to what am I going to do to focus on them to get those things better in their lives. So that's where with the sports betting part, where it can evolve, where there are some clients that we talk sports, and they have bet on sports. But the damage in their gambling wasn't sports, it was poker or it was something else. But what I don't say to them is then, you know what? Because you bet on poker, you can never bet on gambling. Because that's not my lane. Well, I can warn them about there's a slippery slope, and I warn them about that it doesn't take much for you to fall into that world. That's why I have to continue to be asking and screening about that. So it really is, again, it's going to be a holistic view on really recovery. That's why what's really interesting compared to probably about 20 years ago when I first started this, it was much more, okay, I'm going to go algorithm by the book, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 with each patient. But then shortly after a few years, I found out that was not very satisfying to me because I wanted to do a little bit more. I wanted to engage people in deeper connection, conversations. And ultimately what I wanted was what recovery is. Home, health, physical health, mental health, sense of purpose, a sense of usefulness, and a sense of strong, positive community. And far and away, and I could go on and on about this, but this is the thing I see the greatest deficit in all our patients who are struggling is just lack of connection, lack of community, and not being involved. And that's probably where I spend the most time. The whole emphasis today on the sports betting, again, is so many of us who are not familiar with this world don't bring it up or don't think about it. And in Minnesota, when it comes back around in your legislature, these are the issues that have to be taken to task before it gets legalized. So strong language about advertising, strong language about what are we going to do when we find out that people are giving away apps to underage kids. That's what we want to do. Thank you for your comment. All right. Where's that mic? No, it's somewhere in the back.
Hey, Dr. Fong. Robbie from TELUS Health. Thank you for sharing this presentation. It's great. And thanks for talking about being a fan. I think that's really important. You know, I've been meeting my clients really where they're at with being a fan and participating and watching. And I'm seeing it's different for each, you know, client. But a lot of times what I've been doing is talking to them about what their life was like being a fan before action, you know. Getting them to go back, envision that, engage in that, if you will, and connect to that. But I'm finding, too, that some can't. You know, it's just where they're at. And it might be temporary not watching sports, but for the most part, I'm seeing they can. My question to you is about daily fantasy sports. I know I even Susan's laughing, chuckling, because I think I talked to her about this on a recent call, too. I just want to see what your experience and your take is on traditional fantasy sports, harm reduction approach with perhaps an abstinence, we'll say, you know, in-game betting approach with like a mix, if you will. You know, it's September. The Vikings just played the Eagles. It's second weekend, you know. August, September, we all know what happens, you know, with the drafts. And just wanted to see what your experience was.
Well, I'll throw it this way around. You know, again, games that bring people together are what we need. So, out of disclosure, I played fantasy sports since I was a freshman in college. I still play fantasy sports season long with my friends from college. So that gives us a reason to connect every year with the draft and all that stuff. This year we had a Fong Family Fantasy Football League. There's no money. And there's 13 of us that are on it. And it's brought some of the family members closer together. Now, is that disingenuous for me as a gambling researcher to do that? No, because it's fun. There's no money attached to it. Daily fantasy sports is not season-long fantasy sports. It's gambling. Same-day parlay is gambling. So, again, I always go back to when patients are wondering or asking, I say, again, what is the meaning behind this? Is this going to bring more joy to your life, or is it going to be potentially harmful? And anything where there's lying, anything where there's deception, anything where there's putting something at risk that could potentially be harmful, that is not recreation. And that's the biggest key of all, is really, again, with the impact. So we've gone from, you know, when we first started in the field 20 years ago to say absolutely abstinence-based 100%. Now to saying we really do have to have unique perspectives on recovery. And so it's always going to be the questions I ask. How is this going to impact your recovery strength? Is this an activity of recovery that's going to bring you more connection, or is this an activity that could potentially be harmful? That's it. All right, I got to run because the shuttle is awaiting, but you can call me, you can email, you can do whatever you need to do, and you can invite me back out. I'm happy to come back out to Minnesota, only when the weather is this nice. All right,
Great
thank
to
you so
have
much.
you, Tim. Thank you so much.